I enjoy history. Among many things to enjoy in life, I enjoy history. I enjoy reading history books, watching historical documentaries, even the wonky ones that come from all kind of crazy agendas, just to see like what do present-day Catholics think about Martin Luther? Let's watch a documentary about this. The enemy of all enemies. That's interesting to me to see wrong perspectives and things like this. But one thing, of all the craziness of history, the one thing that I miss today, that I wish we still did, you might find it silly, but I wish we still did name announcements. Do you know what I mean? Like, picture yourself at a royal gathering, a festive occasion. There's someone who has the job. How cool is this job? To stand inside the door. This person's got to know every possible guest, every person that could be a guest. And when they see them entering, and as they enter, they sit back there with a loud voice and they say the king and queen walk in. They say, "Sir King John and Lady Queen Jane have arrived of the realm of Newport Richey." Or something like this. I wish we still did that. You might think that's silly, or you might think that's just because I went to cotillion as a kid, because they did that for us when we walked our mothers in to the final ballroom dance and things like this. And it was just wonderful. Everybody, this is normal life for people. It should be, right? Just kidding. You might think it's silly or laugh at this, but the reason they did this is not silly. They wanted to respect and honor and highly esteem the name and the position of those who had lofty positions in society. This isn't as far removed from us as you think. Those of you that watched the Jimmy Carter funeral saw some of this recently, and you'll see more of it at the upcoming presidential inauguration. A lot of formality, a lot of going through motions that you think perhaps are silly, but are there for good reason to honor the office that's in view. Now, the spirit of that, why I go there, the spirit of that royal announcement person is present in our text today. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 9, in the phrase, "Hallowed be your name." So we've come in the Sermon on the Mount to a moment we've long anticipated, the Lord's Prayer, the most famous prayer of all of history, and we are working through it little bit by little bit, phrase, request at a time. And we have come to the second part of verse 9. Hallowed be your name. There are three headings to work through this morning with these four words. See, first, setting the tone. It's our first heading. Well, the first phrase of verse 9, "Our Father in heaven," is really the preface or the introduction into the whole prayer. The second phrase of verse 9, "Hallowed be your name," is really the first petition or first request of the Lord's Prayer. This first request sets the tone for everything else that comes after. That it is in first position is itself worth our attention. So let's spend some time on its prominence. The ultimate reason this request is first in the Lord's Prayer is because this desire is first in the Lord's heart. Because this concerns the glory of God, the honor of God in and over and through all things. This is why God made all things, that all things would be in tune with the grand symphony resounding throughout the whole theater that is creation. We need to be reminded of that. We need to be reminded of this because our problems, our needs, our worries, our anxieties, our joys, our desires, our prayer requests tend to dominate our prayer. And those must not be given the place of priority. Rather, God and the glory of His name must take priority in all our praying, because God's glory is why all things exist. Now, I know it's easy to just make a statement like that and be like, it's true everywhere. But there are exceptions, right? In great suffering, in great persecution, in great trouble, and fear even, it's fitting to enter into prayer just like bursting into the throne room with kind of like a "Father, save me!" But that's the exception, not the norm. The normal posture and practice of prayer is to set all of our stuff aside and place God and His agenda first in the position of prominence. And so if we're going to be a people that pray rightly, we must see the Lord and His glory as the priority in our praying. This request for the hallowing of God's name does not happen on its own. It flows directly out of what we've already seen in the start of verse 9. So when we come to God in prayer, addressing Him as our Father, we are so warmed and encouraged by God the Father's affection and love and mercy. And yet, as we come to our Father in heaven, we are sobered by His greatness and majesty and might. This is God, the one whom there is no other. No one is like Him, and there is no God but Him. He is God. These two realities shape all of our prayer, don't they? They ought to. But they're not the only two realities that shape prayer. When we know God as our Father in heaven, knowing that, it brings forth another desire, specifically, that this God's name be hallowed. What is this word? Hallowed. Perhaps you're one that pronounces all the syllables and you say, hallowed. Hallowed. That's kind of the older KJV style of the prayer. Hallowed be thy name. I just kind of string it all together. Hallowed. What is this? To hallow something is to treat it as holy, to make much of it, to adore it, to praise it, to glorify it. It's the reverent act of setting something aside to treat it as sacred. So for us to do this with God's name means that we are praying, asking that God's name be treated as holy, made much of, adored, praised, glorified, treasured, and set aside from all else so that it would be treated as sacred. That's the general and straightforward meaning of this phrase, and it flows directly on the heels of our Father in heaven. But it's not just looking in the rear view, seeing where it came from. You can look in front of you and see that it also prepares the way for what's coming in verse 10. There we find the next two requests. We're to pray for God's kingdom to come and God's will to be done here on earth as it is in heaven. The connection is clear. God's kingdom will not come His will not be done in a people who don't hallow His name. But if His name is hallowed, you can better believe it, that with the hallowing comes the kingdom and comes the will. And so this is preparatory and places us in the right position for the rest of the Lord's Prayer. I am a man who's convinced of many things. Some of them are silly. Like pickles are like sin. They're the definition of sin. God made the cucumber, we ruined it. Some of you find these things silly. I'm convinced that the placement of this first request in the Lord's Prayer, I'm convinced this ought to stun us. Many godly men and godly women throughout history, and even here in our modern day, perhaps you yourselves, have been one to criticize rightly the wickedness of the modern world. I mean, I know for me, I was born in 1983. There's been a lot of change in the world since 1983 to 2025. And some of you are just shaking your head at me. Others of you are like, oh my gosh, he was born in the 1900s. Both of those are happening right now with the young and the old. A lot has changed, right? I had to master the art of hitting stop and record on my VCR to record my favorite TV shows and make sure I stopped it so I did not recording commercials. Frustrations of the 80s, right? But in regards to morality, the world has been in something of a breakneck downhill sprint, seemingly trying to get as wicked and blasphemous as it possibly can. So much so that it's almost impossible today to live life like going outside without coming week by week, multiple times a week, coming to face blasphemy all around us. This is true. But, you know what I don't see Christians bewailing? Their own prayer life. Christians will mock and scorn the world for their wickedness, while they themselves are profaning the name of God by not placing the glory of God as the central motivating piece of prayer and the central subject of their prayer. This is the first thing that we ought to pray about, the glory of God, the hallowing of His name. How many Christians do this? I mean, how many, if we just took a poll coming in today, as you're coming by the table outside, you're like, okay, list the top 3 things that you pray for. How many Christians would put the glory of God as number 1? Yet, here this is, in the place of first position, setting the tone for all that follows. We are rebuked and ought to be. And we're instructed in how to pray healthier. This is why this phrase, our first heading, sets the tone for all of prayer and for all the Lord's Prayer. Now, secondly, C, toward a definition. You might think that's a weird heading. It is a little weird because I didn't want to say the definition, because the glory of God is beyond words. Yet words have to be here. This is a sermon. And yet Proverbs says, where there are many words, sin is not absent. So this is a precarious moment. But let's rush in where angels fear to tread, toward a definition. We've seen the word hallowed and what it means, but after it comes the word name. This is the moment in this phrase where I think confusion happens. And people stop and they ask a question that they should ask, that I asked in the study of this. Why do we ask for the name of God to be hallowed? I mean, shouldn't we just ask that God himself be hallowed? Like, let's ask for the glory of God to be made much of, for him to be glorified and praised, not the name. Wouldn't that be better? Well, no, it wouldn't be. The word name in verse 9 is not unimportant to this first request. Many just adjust the phrase and they remove the request portion and they just say it's a statement of truth, as if we begin the Lord's Prayer like, "Our Father in heaven, your name is holy." Who's going to argue with that? I will. If you won't, I will. It's true. God is holy. We sang the song, the holiness song. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty. This is who God is perfectly, infinitely, eternally, more than we know. But this is not a statement. It's a request. It's a petition. It's an asking something. And so, this leads to the next question we ought to be asking. What exactly is it that we're praying for in this first request? That God's name, if name is so important, what are we praying for then? Well, the answer to this comes slowly, but I think surely. It comes first when we look at the 10 Commandments. Exodus chapter 20, verse 7 contains the words of the third commandment that say the following: "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." Here, God is publicly displaying his great concern. He is holy. Therefore, his great command, one of the 10, is that his people treat his name rightly, meaning holy. We got to treat his name rightly, and the one who doesn't will not find forgiveness in the third commandment. His name should be treated holy. More of the answer then comes as we look in the Psalms and name in the Psalms. Here's a smattering of examples. Psalm 5:11. "But let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them ever sing for joy. Spread your protection over them, that those who love your name may exult in you." Interesting. Psalm 20, verse 7. "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." Psalm 25:11. "For your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my guilt, for it is great." Psalm 138, verse 2. "I bow down toward your holy temple and give thanks to your name, for your steadfast love and for your faithfulness. For you have exalted above all things your name and your word." There's a lot more places we could go. It's everywhere in the Old Testament. People back in ancient times, this made far more sense to them than it does to us today. I mean, just think about the way we use names today. We generally, as we're getting to know someone, we're introduced to someone, we grow in friendship with them. Initially, we use their name a lot in conversation, but then once we get to know them and we start relating to them on more of a friendly term, we tend to drop the name and insert nickname or other term of endearment, and then that becomes the new normal. So, for example, Holly and I have been married 17 years. When I first met Holly, as you can imagine, you've seen her, she was so intimidating. Tall, beautiful, you just like athletic, like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? So scary. Mentioning her name was almost like a trepidatious thing, but as I was getting to know her, we're first talking, I used her name all the time, and she used mine. But now 17 years later, we've dropped the names, and I just call Holly, or we just call each other babe or love. Holly does this with me too. It's not very often I hear Adam. When I do, something was done that should not have been done, or something was undone that should have been done. That's an example of names today. In ancient days, it was different. Someone's name then was bound up with the person. So much so that, quote, I'm quoting a history book here, the name of a person then partakes in the quality and characteristics of the person. This was the worldview of the biblical authors in the Old Testament when they penned the scriptures and penned the Psalms that we've just quoted. And this sheds light onto what we mean when speaking of the name of God in the Bible. It's not just the label that's identifying the person we're talking to. When the scriptures talk about the name, the person is in view. And so, in Psalm 5:11, when it says, spread your protection over them, let them ever sing for joy, for those who love your name exult in you. This is to say, those who love you exalt in you, O God. That's the meaning of name. And in every other use of for your name's sake, O Lord, for your sake, O Lord, is what's in view when the name comes up. And it's not just an Old Testament thing, it's a New Testament thing. The same cultural framework is present in the first century. It took a while for that to change. As the ages developed, come to church history in the evenings, you'll discover why, as Brad traces this out for us. But the New Testament authors thought this too. That's why the Lord's Prayer says what it does in this first request. So to ask that God's name be hallowed or glorified is to ask that God be hallowed or glorified. Another way we can see this is the Greek. It was first written in Greek, the New Testament was, and the word English, name, in Greek is the word onoma. Onoma, which name's a good translation for it, most of the Greek scholars say, but there's another possible option. Name and reputation. Isn't that interesting? So if we retranslate the Lord's Prayer, we then get Our Father in heaven. Hallowed be your reputation. So we see the gist of what's being asked, isn't it? To ask that God's reputation be hallowed is to ask that God himself be not just well thought of, but loved, adored, famous, spreading his fame from shore to shore. You almost get a sense of missions in this word name. It needs to be seen and spread. Your name be hallowed. But maybe you're still asking a question. I was at this point in my study this past week asking, why are we praying for the name of God to be hallowed anyway, or God to be hallowed anyway? I mean, isn't God already hallowed? Isn't His name already holy and set apart as sacred? Why then must I ask that that be in a sense greater? Can God get holier because of my little contribution to His glory? No, is the right answer. But it's a good question because it exposes the heart of this first request. So to ask that God's name be hallowed is not to ask that God would become holier than He already is. He is perfect in holiness. To pray asking God's name be hallowed is to pray that more and more and more and more souls see the Holy One, love the Holy One, and spread this Holy One. It's a desire that the whole world would be greatly stunned by this great God, whose greatness is unsearchable. That the whole world, may the day come that the whole world would never speak of God without the reverence and love due His name. That's the heart of the prayer. So we've seen the dominant position that sets the tone for all that follows after. We've seen something of a definition of what this really means when we ask it, but we're not done yet, right? Because if we're really understanding, preaching is not just information, right? It'd be a lecture if I'm just aiming at information. This aims at what the Holy Spirit can only do, transformation. So how does this get into our bones, and how do we actually live in light of this first request in the Lord's Prayer? So lastly, see the third heading, His name hallowed in us. A Christian who prays this first request in the Lord's Prayer will want to see the prayer answered. Is that too first grade? I don't think it's too first grade. I mean, of course, merely saying these words can be empty and hollow if it's just vain repetition. Like, hey, Jesus taught me to pray this, so I'm going to pray it. Your name be hallowed. If you don't mean it, it's empty. But the Christian will not only mean it, they'll want the prayer to come true and be answered in their own life. In Psalm 34:3, we get a taste of this. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt His name together. On this text, Martin Lloyd-Jones, in his wonderful volume Studies on the Sermon on the Mount, he said this: what a strange idea. At first sight, this appears to be quite ridiculous. God, the eternal, the self-existent one, absolute and perfect in all His beauty, how can feeble man ever magnify such a being? How can we ever make God great or greater? How can we exalt the name that is already highly exalted over all? Doesn't this seem preposterous and ridiculous? But yet, of course, when we realize the way the Lord's Prayer works and the words Jesus gives, we shall see exactly what is meant. He does not mean that we actually add to the greatness of God. That's impossible. But He does mean that He is concerned that this greatness of God appears to be greater to all men. Thus, we can magnify the name of God. We can do so by our words and by our lives reflecting the greatness of His glory. Such a good quote. But while good, we ought to ask, give me some more. Like rubber's got to meet the road here. That's high, lofty language. Like what does this really mean about Monday morning or Sunday at 12:20 when we leave? What's this mean when I walk out the door and start living life? So I want to give you 4 ways that we can practically apply these things to daily life. All 4 are saying the same thing, but they're going to do it in 4 different ways. One might be more helpful to you than others. If that's the case, drop the other 3, or maybe you'll find them all to be great. First, one way of describing how we hallow the name of God in daily life is to speak positively and negatively. So positively, God's name will be hallowed in our lives if we see God's holiness, savor and enjoy the holy God, and desire and endeavor to live holy ourselves. In this way, our holy living, though imperfect, will shine out and reflect the holy God Himself. And Matthew 5:16 in view, remember, let your light so shine before others that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who's in heaven. Matthew 5:16 will happen, and the world will notice the beauty of your life, which has nothing to do with you, but of God who is leading you in this. That's positively. Negatively, God's name will be profaned in our lives if we ignore God's holiness, savor unholy pursuits, and endeavor after all kinds of sin. In this way, our sinful living will stand out in stark contrast, and the world, Matthew 5:16, will notice the contradiction between God, the holy God, and His sinful people. So, with the positive-negative image, it shows us that we ought to live all of life as if God's name by our life is always hallowed and never profaned. That's the first way we could talk about this. The second way is OCH. We know OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Some of you think I'm OCC, obsessive compulsive, about the chairs in church. Someone's got to make sure they're in rows that are like perfectly straight. Someone, back to the point. We are all of us OCH, obsessive compulsive hallowers. What I mean by saying this is you're not neutral. You know what I mean? You don't pop into this world neutral as if you're not for or against anything. You're just Switzerland for your whole life. This is not reality. We come into this world sinful and are bent in all the wrong directions, but we're still made in the image of God, and part of the image of God is that we are by nature hallowers, meaning we will make much of something. Our lives we will always seek to find that center thing about our lives that we can build an identity on. And we can be about, and we can evangelize CrossFit or pickles or whatever you want, whatever's cool to you, right? We're always trying to find that centering thing that we build a life on. Sin perverts this in us such that the sinner always tries to build a life on something that is bad for us. bad isn't quite the word, that something that will lead us to death. That's what the sinner does. By grace, God comes in and redeems and floods the dungeon with light. And then all of a sudden, the new Christian desires to build a life on Him and hallow Him. We are, all of us, obsessive, compulsive hallowers. May our hallowing be in line with what we were made to hallow. That's the second way we could talk about this. The third way, I want to take you to first grade science class and tell you, if you didn't know, the difference between a microscope and a telescope. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I'm sorry. I don't have a degree in science. But if I'm correct, a microscope, right, you look in the hole, and it makes the small thing bigger so you can see it. It's very scientific language, bigger. The telescope does something different. You look in the hole, if the cap's not on. It's always the mistake with that for some reason. You look in the hole and you see something massively beyond description in an observable way to our small eye. That's the difference. John Piper is famous for saying this. It's all throughout his work. You read one of his books, you'll find this image in it. When we come to talk about us, believers, glorifying God, we need to be careful when we use the word, let's magnify the Lord. Because we never magnify God as if we were microscopes. Meaning, God is really little, and I need to, by my life, make Him really big and compelling and beautiful so people can come to this little bitty God. Rather, we magnify God by telescoping Him. Our whole life is to be about making God, who's huge, observable to other small eyes like our own. And so throughout all of life, we need to make sure our telescope is pointed in the right direction, the lens is clear, and the cap is off, lest we be in the dark. That's the Christian life. The fourth way is very simple and short. We could just quote Martin Luther, his children's catechism, so instructive. He asked the kids, how is it, kids, that God's name is hallowed among us? You imagine a 4-year-old like, what? Luther said, God's name will be hallowed among us when our life and our doctrine are truly Christian. That's it. But how much is held in that Q&A? Church, the bottom line is that how we live really matters. We can live in such a way that brings honor to the name of God, that hallows God Himself, or we can live in a way that profanes the name of God and causes other people to profane the name of God. I don't think any sinner will make it to heaven doing this perfectly, but our aim is to always be telescopes of glory, not instruments of profanity and blasphemy to God. I wonder how this hits you. Like, how are you responding to this right now? This first request to the Lord's Prayer, which has nothing to do with you. Is God egomaniacal? Is he a narcissist? It's all about him. Jeez. Or is God so insecure that he needs constant compliment to reaffirm his own worth? I mean, that's kind of what the first century Greek and Roman gods were. Maybe this God's the same. He needs our compliment for reassurance so he can keep powerfully reigning. If we withhold that from him, he'll grow weak and we'll become the gods. There are really people that think this. This is what C.S. Lewis believed before he became a Christian. Not to look at anybody or make names, so I'll just look down. Lewis said, God to the atheist looks like a vain old woman desiring compliments. But to the believer, he looks like the source of infinite delight because his glory satisfies the soul. So I do not think God is egomaniacal. I do not think God is a self-centered, insecure narcissist. I think God is holy and is infinitely and justly right to demand praise from all creatures because he's the only one worthy of it. So I don't know if you've noticed, as you look around our sanctuary, you've maybe seen the wood burnings on the wall, the quotes on the back. If you've noticed that over there, that framed picture, that is the words of Westminster Shorter Catechism, question 1. The question is, what is the chief end of man? End not meaning death, end meaning purpose. So what's the chief purpose of man? Answer: man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. I love that question. But I don't like the word and. Because it gives the impression that these are two separate things. Sometimes in life we glorify God. Sometimes in life we enjoy God. This is the chief end of man. If we took out the word and replaced it with by, you have something of what the heart of Scripture teaches us. The way God is glorified is by sinful man enjoying his holiness. How in the world would that ever happen? Only through the gospel, where Jesus took our sin to free us from that sin, and in that freedom, we are free to enjoy the glories and beauties of God forevermore. This is the first and great request of the Lord's Prayer. Pray with me.